Dr. Dean Radin is one of the world's foremost researchers into psychic phenomena. He is Chief Scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and has held appointments at Princeton University, the University of Edinburgh and SRI International, where he worked on a classified program investigating psychic phenomena for the US government. He spoke to the Eternities podcast about his latest book, Supernormal Science, Yoga and the Evidence for Extraordinary Psychic Abilities, of which one reviewer claimed, "It reveals how we can awaken to innate human potentials that are glorious." I began by asking him about these potentials and how we might awaken them.
In a sense, I can give, and I will give a list of potentials, but even more important is simply the idea that we have inherent potentials which are not being used. I think most people, most of the time, don't have much attention paid on the fact that they may not be doing the best that they can do. And of course, people who do any kind of disciplined training, whether it's meditation or in sports or learning a language or whatever, you can learn new things, sometimes dramatically new. But here we're talking about almost being human plus, as you say in your novel. It's going beyond what we ordinarily think of as human and something quite advanced, say. And for other people, what I'll say then about our potentials is not so new or even that exciting because they live in those states. What I'm talking about primarily are the whole variety of psychic experiences and psychic abilities that can be trained. And if for somebody who believes that they are psychic already, this comes as no news. But I'm talking more about training to a level that we generally don't see very often, that are historically described, but not so often in the modern world. And so these potentials are what we think of as ordinary psychic stuff, like telepathy and clairvoyance and so on, but at a much, much better degree of precision and robustness than what we typically see in today's world.
Mm-hmm. So you started the book with the Buddha, and you asked the question, did the Buddha have more than just wisdom and charisma, or was he truly enlightened with supernormal abilities? And then you go on to talk about yoga and the faculties that can then arise from this practice.
Right.
What do you mean by truly by the Buddha being enlightened, and how would these faculties have arisen, and what would be the evidence for them?
Well, the opening gambit in this is asking the question, was Buddha just a nice guy? And that question comes out of discussions between the Dalai Lama and scientists in the Mind and Life Institute dialogues over the past 20-some years. When the Dalai Lama talks about the benefits of meditation, the neuroscientists are excited, and they've done many studies, and that has led actually to pretty good advancement in our understanding of at least some of the abilities of the mind, namely things like if you are a disciplined meditator, then the morphology and the function of your brain will change, and change quickly. And previously,
in what ways does the brain change from meditation?
Well, for example, you'll end up getting more gray matter in the cortex or in the brain. You can change. You're literally changing the shape as a result of exercising what amounts to a muscle that you don't normally use. So in the same way that your biceps will increase if you start doing curls, your brain changes as a result of what you do. And in this case...
Sorry, this is quantitative change in the brain.
Yes.
Yeah.
Shape changes in the brain that are measurable. And by the same token, functional changes as well. As seen, for example, in monks who do what's called deity yoga or deity meditation, where their practice is to intently visualize very colorful, very complicated mandalas, to the point where they can sustain for many, many minutes a very highly detailed mental image. This was thought to be impossible by neuroscience because to maintain images for a matter of seconds is considered to be what's typical. So there are experiments done with the monks and with controls who were not meditators to see if in fact these images could be maintained for that long, and the monk showed that it could for many, many minutes. And these are very complicated mandalas. So this is then showing that there's an aspect of what amounts to mind and brain training that literally changes the function of the brain as a result of what the mind is doing. And this, of course, has led to a whole rash of books on train your mind, train your brain, and that sort of thing, brain power. It's all neuroscience oriented, which is fine. But then the Dalai Lama starts asking about reincarnation and the oracle in Tibet and other things we'd consider to be supernormal abilities or psychic abilities. And the neuroscientists say, well, there's no evidence for that. We don't know anything about it. So the problem may not even true. And then the discussion stops. And when you read through these, the proceedings of these meetings, then what you end up with is they're talking a lot about Buddhism and Buddha and meditation. And the conclusion from a science point of view is that Buddha was a nice guy. There can't be anything more. And so I'm asking the question from a slightly different perspective. I'm saying, well, not only Buddha, but Jesus and Moses and Muhammad and you name it, all of our religious figures are revered not simply because they were nice guys, or maybe nice gals in some cases, but because there are miracles and supernormal abilities that were associated with them, which gave their followers and later students the idea that these people were in touch with something important. And so this is where the notion of enlightenment comes in, where enlightenment is defined in different ways in different traditions, but in general it means that you've reached a state of awareness where you know that you or yourself with a small s is identical to self with a large S, which is identical to the universe at large. Mm-hmm. So you and the universe are the same, and it's known not simply intellectually, but as a living experience.
Yeah. Isn't there evidence that in meditation there's an area of the brain that is dampened, that is most to do with one's sense of individuality, and that therefore the consciousness is opened up to transcending the small self and connecting with all that there is?
There are indications that certain areas of the frontal lobes are involved in maintaining a sense of individuality. And there are various circuits thought to be in the brain that are related to even more subtle things like feelings of empathy and in yourself and feelings of empathy in others. And all of that, this is mostly known through functional MRI research. But the fact that there's a correlation between brain function and the reports of these experiences, first of all, shouldn't be too surprising, because the fact that there's a correlation between brain function and subjective experience is well known. The question is, what's giving rise to what? You know, where's the causal arrow pointing here? Is it the brain that's giving rise to these experiences, or are the experiences giving rise to certain patterns of activity in the brain? From a mainstream neuroscience point of view, the brain is all there is, and so the brain is generating these experiences. From other points of view, the brain is like a receiver, like a very fancy television set that is especially attuned to what we call consciousness, which may not have anything to do with the brain.
Is there as yet any evidence that points to that being the case, that the brain is more of a receiver rather than a creator of consciousness?
Well, that's where That's where the evidence for phenomena like telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition, especially precognition, comes from. What those experiences suggest, and what has been confirmed to some extent in the laboratory, is that those experiences are not compatible with what we currently know about the functioning of the brain itself. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that I'm talking about non-physical or non-material aspects of awareness, because we don't actually know yet what the bounds of physicality is. Our whole idea about the nature of material has significantly changed over the past century, and I imagine it will continue to change. But what it does say is that at least today's understanding of the brain as a mass of neurons, and they're doing information processing, that cannot account for something like clairvoyance, because there's no sensory mechanism that will reach at a distance, or precognition, because we don't know of any way of reaching through time. That then suggests that it may be more compatible to think of consciousness, whatever that is, some sort of background sentience of the universe, that may not only exist independently of our physical structure, but it doesn't exactly live in space and time in the way that our bodies do. And if that were true, then the brain as a receiver makes more sense, because some aspect of your awareness may in fact extend through space and time, and it in essence becomes highly constrained by the thing we call the brain, which is the receiver of consciousness.
And this is the most challenging thing to the mainstream scientists, isn't it? But you outline, I think, 8 doctrines of science in the book, things like realism, reductionism, and materialism, and then you seem to undermine each of them, which sort of attacks the edifice of opponents of psi.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. In some cases, we can say that the basic doctrines are wrong. We know they're wrong now. In other cases, we can raise questions about them. But the point of mentioning the eightfold path of science, which of course is it's a
reference to the Buddhist eightfold path,
and also the yoga Ashtanga eightfold path. But so this eightfold assumptions, what it amounts to in science, there's serious reasons to doubt that the assumptions that we've dealt with so far, which have been very successful, and which there's good reason to be very cautious about dropping any of those assumptions, but some of them we know are wrong. And so far the difficulty is, and it hasn't been clear yet what to replace them with. If we can find ways to replace our existing assumptions, that will be a major advancement in science. And so I hear this all the time by people who either have psychic experience or they're already convinced by the data, and then they become they want to know what's next. How they become impatient that we haven't developed ourselves into the 23rd century already. And so I'll say, well, I would be very happy to do experiments to look at other ways of even thinking about these things, but we haven't figured out how to do that yet. I mean, other than experientially, taking a psychedelic drug or meditating a long time, you can explore all kinds of interesting states. But to cast that into science as we know it, using slightly different assumptions or even major difference in assumptions, we don't know.
Yeah, you had a very famous experiment that seemed to use science's own methods to demonstrate evidence of precognition. Mm-hmm. I think it was you published a paper, Electrodermal Presentiments of Future Emotions. Mm-hmm. How has this now been digested by mainstream science, and has your data been replicated and so on?
Well, I first did that study using skin conductance to look at how the body might react before a stimulus occurs. I thought of it actually in 1993 when I was at the University of Edinburgh. And I'm not entirely sure why I thought of it, but I thought, well, this seems to make sense, that if precognition is real, and we were taking in physiological measures at that time, which are very good at picking up your unconscious, then maybe the body would respond before a stimulus.
So you had the skin wired up, and then the subjects would be viewing various material. Is this correct?
Yes. Yeah, so the first study I thought of was partially sparked by a story that a colleague told me. And the story is this. He was a hunter, and he was planning on going on a hunting trip in 2 weeks. So he was in the process of cleaning his rifles, and then he was cleaning a pistol. The pistol was a 6-shot double-action revolver, which means that you pull the trigger and the cylinder revolves, and then pulls back the hammer, and then the hammer hits the next bullet in the chamber, all in one smooth motion. So he's cleaning that. He takes out 6 bullets, and then he cleans it, and he starts to put the bullets back in. He puts in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then he leaves the last bullet out because he said that there was something wrong with it. It didn't feel right. I mean, it was a perfectly fine bullet, but something was wrong or off about that bullet, so he left it aside. So then 2 weeks go by. He's with his buddies. They go out hunting, and then they start drinking that evening. And this is not recommended when there are guns in the house, because a fight breaks out. Somebody grabs his gun at one point and points it to a friend point blank in his face and starts pulling the trigger. Well, if you pull the trigger in a double-action revolver, it's going to shoot. So fortunately, he had taken one of the bullets out, so when the cylinder revolved and the hammer clicked, rather than shooting the friend in the face, it went click because it went into the empty chamber. And at that moment, he suddenly had this sense of horror that if he had not taken out that bullet, then somebody would be dead. So the way he puts it is that everyone has a bullet with their name on it, and he knows where that bullet is, in his case, and he put it into a safety deposit box. And later he actually showed me the bullet. So here's an example of a fairly common type of premonition that something in the future is not quite right, and he was able to intervene in it. So I said, okay, how can I simulate that kind of very dramatic experience in the laboratory without actually harming anyone? And the answer is that this is kind of done all the time in laboratory studies of emotion, especially emotional responses and how it impacts on your physiology. So the way you do this in the lab, you use an international standard set of photographs, some of which are very calm, like a picture of a lamp, and some of which are very emotional, like a scene of a car wreck, or a surgical suite, and some are also very emotional in terms of being erotic. So you present pictures randomly, and then in a conventional way, you would, as soon as the picture shows up, you can see all kinds of changes happening in the body. The heart rate changes, and skin changes, and everything changes. So there are thousands of studies using this method to study physiological responses and anticipation for physiology and how other kinds of manipulations will change your emotional reaction and so on. So the only thing I did different was say, okay, we're going to present a series of randomly presented pictures with different emotionality. We'll measure things like skin conductance and heart rate and brain waves. And we'll do it in a completely conventional way except with one change. We're going to go a couple of seconds before the picture is selected and is shown and see whether the body is already beginning to change. Now, the reason why this would not have been seen in conventional studies is that what you do is, and when you analyze the data, you create a baseline immediately. You take whatever the skin conductance level is immediately before the image appears. That becomes your baseline. And so you basically get rid of any variations before the image appears. So all we did is go back a few more seconds and call our baseline, say, 3 seconds before the image appears. And now we're saying, does the baseline change before an image appears? Well, it turns out that it does. And it does in the direction suggesting that before you see an emotional picture, you start to become more emotional, and vice versa. So I did that study and presented it at a conference, and one of my colleagues in the Netherlands said, this is ridiculous. This is way too good. And so he set out to replicate it, and fortunately he was able to replicate it pretty quick and get the same result. So from that point, then it was 97 by the time that happened, there are now over 40 replications from laboratories around the world, roughly 15 labs, and a meta-analysis was published last year collecting all of the studies using the same kind of design, of which there are something like 21 or 22 studies, again from multiple labs. And it's very clear from that analysis that this is a repeatable effect seen in many laboratories. And what's more important is that because these kinds of studies are done in the mainstream for very conventional reasons, that if you get the data from one of those studies and you analyze it according to the way that we're doing, which is looking at the baseline many seconds before the stimulus rather than immediately before, you also find the effect in that data, in mainstream data already published for other reasons. And that's important because it means that what we're seeing in the lab it should not be that surprising. These are not magic tricks that are suddenly happening just for us. It has to be an inherent skill or inherent ability that everyone has, even when you're not looking for it.
So how are the mainstream skeptics responding to this evidence?
They don't.
They simply ignore it.
There's no response. Yeah. No, there's no response because while the data are what the data are. We have fact-like data that we can say, well, this simply occurs. The very next thing that people will say, whether they're sympathetic or skeptical or not, they'll say, well, how can you explain that? And so science is a two-step. It's facts and observations, and it's explanations that go along with it. So our explanation for this kind of phenomena is that we know from standard physics that classical physics and quantum physics are time symmetric. That means that the equations work just the same way forward in time and backwards in time. And from the equations alone, you couldn't tell whether something is forward or backwards in time, and this creates a symmetry. So maybe what we're seeing physiologically here is a reflection of some aspect of consciousness which is actually either time symmetric or, I think more likely, that it's actually not in time in the usual way we think of it. Our bodies are in time. There's some aspect of physicality which clearly has a thermodynamic arrow pointing in one direction, but there's something about our subjective sense that doesn't seem to be in that same place. And that would then be kind of a proto-explanation. But from a physics perspective, people who don't know about physics will say, well, this is impossible because it violates physics. Well, the fact is it doesn't violate anything in physics. It just is just a strange way of thinking about physics as being applied to your experience.
Yeah. How do you see this kind of culture clash between the materialists and the skeptics and those who are open to Sci and its researchers such as yourself? How do you see that clash panning out in the next years?
Well, it's no different than many other controversies in science. Science at the leading edge in every field, every discipline, you have people screaming at each other all the time because that's the nature of the unknown. It's almost by definition, people are scrambling about to understand the nature of the leading edge. How it pans out eventually is tricky because if an explanation, a satisfactory explanation cannot be found, then the observations may be decades or centuries ahead of the rest of science. I think that we're probably within 20 to 50 years of getting explanations that most scientists will say, okay, now I see that this is plausible. And that is because the gigantic change in physics in terms of our understanding the nature of physicality and space and time based on quantum mechanics. Because we're now 70 or 80 years from the development of quantum mechanics, and the fundamentals, our means of interpreting what it means, are still very active. It's a hot and active topic, and the more we look into it, the stranger it becomes. And that means that our understanding of physicality itself was not quite right. And as we then move into quantum biology and eventually quantum psychology, I think we'll find that while we still may have all of the pieces of the jigsaw pulled together, we'll begin to see a pattern evolving which suggests that there are aspects of us, even purely in a physical sense, that are spread out in space and time. But of course, most of us are right here and right now, but that's not all there is. We're also spread out.
And this is the insight of the mystic, isn't it? My last podcast was with my friend, the consciousness theorist Anthony Peake, who I think has had some contact with you.
Yes.
He's just written a book probing the means by which mystical transcendent experiences may be activated, and he argues that the pineal gland is key, and there was new weight recently added to this with the discovery of dimethyltryptamine in the pineal glands of live rats. I was wondering, what do you think might be the physical agents that enable such experiences and supernormal faculties?
Well, it might be endogenous DMT. That's a possibility. The brain produces hundreds of neurochemicals, some of which may combine in unusual ways. I think of this as, let's simply assume that the brain is a kind of receiver. It's a receiver of something that we call consciousness, for want of a better term, and that you can tune that receiver to behave in different ways depending on its physical structure and its functioning. So by analogy, if we had an old analog TV set, we would never know by the functioning of that TV set that there's digital broadcasting, like high definition digital broadcasting. So somebody may come along and say, well, if you tweak this circuit and you change that component, you're going to get an entirely different picture. Well, you'd say that's crazy. But it turns out that it's true. You change it, and then suddenly there's these signals which are out there all the time, which you are unaware of, that gives you a sense, like you can cast this now back into experience, a sense of reality which is much more vivid and much more real, and it's there. And once you figure out how to get it, you got it. Now the difference then between that metaphor and what's going on in the mind, in the brain, is that when you tweak the components of the TV set, it's permanent. And people don't report permanent experiences of other realities, typically. And the one exception, and the reason why I focused on yoga as this exception, is the achieving the state of samadhi in meditation, and in particular then practicing samyama, which leads to the yogic superpowers, because the yogic superpowers are not described as being a hit or miss or a weak phenomenon. It's considered to be permanent and strong. So there's the difference between a spontaneous psychic experience, perhaps experienced under the influence of a drug, as compared to something which is under control by the mind and strong and reliable. The difference is the equivalent of taking your TV set and swapping an electronic component for a while versus somehow getting inside the TV set and understanding it to the point where you permanently swap out a board that now gives you access to something completely different. And for some people, they can do it very easily because people have talents in different domains. In this case, though, most people will need some serious meditative practice, and they need to achieve certain states like samadhi and be able to sustain it in order to be able to do that kind of re-engineering of the brain, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm interested to know where our evolution is going to go. We have incredible technology coming online at the moment, which is one of the themes of my novel. I was concerned with, these sort of machine cyborg dreams of transhumanism, which I write about in the novel. And the transhumanists think that through technology that they'll be able to connect minds, via computers and such concepts of telepathy and teleempathy and things like this, but via technology only, because they tend to be materialistic, most of them. Do you see such developments as a danger, or do you see it as actually it could aid our understanding and development of human consciousness, or do you see that as simply that? Do you foresee that these advances will be overtaken anyway by a greater understanding of psychic phenomenon and the consequential knock-on effect to our worldview?
I guess I don't see it as negative at all. If we can imagine cyborgs that are developed to the point where the technology becomes more and more subtle, and eventually is absorbed somehow into the body, and it's invisible, or at least extremely microscopic. Maybe at some point we'll recognize that, and also we get used to the phenomena. We get used to something like really, really good high-fidelity telepathy. I think that changes the belief of individuals and of society as an important component in this. We know that from laboratory studies. And just in general, if you don't believe something, you're closed to it. But if it gets to the point where you see people talking in the air, as we do now with cell phones, but there's no cell phone around, and then the person's using telepathy to talk to somebody. If that becomes common knowledge, and especially if the technology itself becomes invisible somehow, it absorbs into the body, it could be a next step in evolution, because perhaps at some point people realize, oh, you know what, I forgot to turn on the telepathic receiver today, and it still worked, because we've transcended the technology and we recognize it was here all along. We just didn't believe it.
It could do that, but it could also represent a kind of a period at the end of history, or at the end of our own development of our own inner faculties.
Possibly, yes, that is another scenario. We could become so dependent on the technology that we lose track of what we're actually capable of. And of course, I don't know which direction it would go, but I think that the yogic path is not an easy one. And when we hear stories about these kinds of phenomena, they're typically by very advanced yogis who spent an enormous amount of time by themselves in caves in the Himalayas. And that environment still exists, but it's extremely rare and refined.
So that path is not for everybody, obviously, but you seem to posit at the end of your book that our worldview will shift, and that the worldview of the average person, therefore, will ultimately shift. I think you say we're going to move to a kind of idealistic, or is it mental monism kind of worldview? How do you see that happening? How do you see the average person as being affected and shifting to seeing reality in the way that mystics see the transcendental reality?
Well, the average person, I'm not sure that would happen for a very, very long time. Most people don't have the luxury to worry about these kinds of ideas. I've already been criticized for using words like epistemology and ontology in the book, because these apparently have too many syllables, and it's so far outside the realm where where the general population thinks about,
Yeah.
that they just don't want to. They don't want to deal with it. So this will probably continue for a very long time because, as I said, most people don't care or want to think about such things. But there will always be a certain strata of society that is deeply into philosophy and other academic topics. And in a sense, that's what drives civilization, but it's very, very slow driver. So what my hope is that when we realize that, or at least leaders realize that at least some aspects of the direction that the whole planet is moving, that there's something very important about the mental state. And I'm not talking simply about the use of propaganda, which of course is used all the time to change mental states in a collective. But here it's more like if there really was a concern about the environment or about political unrest and those sorts of things, that there'd be a much greater or more concentration on imagining there's something like a collective mind, and to move the collective mind in the direction that you wish the entire planet to go, not just from a sociological point of view, but physically as well. So that would require a gigantic change, because the only way we've done that so far is through propaganda and advertising. So in some respects, what I'm saying is that you take existing methods of advertising, which do a drum beat to get people to get ready to go to war, and they do a drum beat so we all drink Coca-Cola and so on. We take that idea and we advance it up to the point where we can see we can change things about the climate, for example, simply by having everyone agree mentally that this is what we need to do. So this is actually not probably not as popular an idea as a more mystical worldview, because it almost becomes crass. It's like taking existing advertising techniques and souping it up a few thousand times, and that could very easily collapse into a nightmare scenario, or if we're lucky, it'll collapse into something which is much better than the way we see it today. It depends a lot on what leaders think is a good thing to do.
Yeah, I think there could be great changes if the average person would recognize recognize their connectedness to others and the world. And I think that one of the dangerous elements of the average mindset, I think in the modern world, is a sense of, you live, you die, that's it, that's your little part in the game. So why should you care about the bigger picture? And I think that the mystical experience, or at least the worldview, if that was more widely carried in the population, I think we would have a transformed world. And I think you mentioned that in the concluding part of your book.
Mm-hmm. It's true. If we were able to change the societal belief, and this is not for everybody, because there certainly are a lot of people in the world who believe in religious notions of that this is not the only life you're going to live. But nevertheless, it seems that the world at large, in general, is greedy. And a lot of the greed comes from desperation. There are people who really need stuff just to live. But beyond that, the greed for people to become ultra wealthy and ultra in almost every sense, a lot of that is probably driven by the sense that you do live once. And so you have to use every resource you possibly can in order to have a comfortable life. If somehow we all knew that we're temporarily inhabiting a body, and we're going to come back in many different forms, maybe not just here, but in other planets, other dimensions, who knows, that would probably reduce a lot of the anxiety associated with how do you simply survive. Of course, knowing it and knowing the idea of it are quite different. If we actually knew that this was the case, and we had some kind of evidence that we could believe in, that would be a massive change in how we operate ourselves in the planet.